at the time, I didn't know that it was called the Jew room. But what I did know was that there were rooms that were off limits to me, in spite of my well above top secret clearances, off limits to me because I was a Jew. And I found out about this, and I can tell you about this because the Pentagon didn't require that I redact this. The head of the Hebrew department was my roommate, and I loved the guy. He got drunk one evening at a social event, and when we were talking shop, which is a big no-no, he let out, apparently his conscience was bothering him, number one. And number two, when the alcohol goes in, the truth comes out. He took his finger and he poked me seriously. There are rooms in NSA that you can't get into because you're a Jew.
Good evening. My name is Yehuda Meir Lipson. I am currently a resident in Israel, originally from Canada. My honor and privilege to introduce this evening's guest on Tamar's show, Bruce Brill. Bruce Brill is a former National Security Agency Mideast analyst for the United States. Some say he is Henry Kissinger's worst nightmare, being an honest man inside the NSA. He authored a book entitled Deceit of an Ally, a memoir of military anti-Semitism, NSA's secret Jew room, and Yom Kippur War treachery. In it, he tells the secret story of how Israel was lulled into unpreparedness for the Arab sneak attack that almost destroyed the Jewish state in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. You can find out more on his website at brucebrill.com.
Thank you so much, Yehuda Meir. Appreciate you helping produce this show and making this interview go on. And I want to welcome Bruce again, Bruce Brill. And again, he's the author of this book. I hope you can see it clearly in front of the camera. And when you wrote this book and you were telling me about it, actually even beforehand, you were telling me, Bruce, that you could have been the original Jonathan Pollard, in that the United States government was anti-Semitic. They were looking for some type of perhaps someone to blame or scandal or something. Can you make that more clear to myself and the audience?
The first thing I want to make clear is that it wasn't the United States government. It was a cabal within the intelligence community, because most of the folks that worked in the intelligence community were supportive of Israel. But there's a cabal within the community that's secret within the community that worked against Israel. So it's not the US government.
Okay.
Okay, so
where would you like to start?
I guess I could start a few days before the Yom Kippur War, when it was made known to me that Egypt and Syria were going to attack Israel on Saturday. That would be Yom Kippur, the 6th of October. And we knew, and my supervisor said that this is what's called a vow, that there's no doubt that they are definitely going to attack Israel.
The Arab countries.
Syria and Egypt. And on the first day of the war, I was one of the few interpreters who could just both Arabic and Hebrew. And so I was given a special job to monitor communication from the battlefront. And on the first day of the war, among other soldiers and among other communication, I picked up an Israeli soldier on the Bar-Lev line That's a string of fortifications along the Suez Canal. He calls home to his mother, and I won't go into detail about what he said, because if you look at my book, it was reviewed and approved for publication by the United States Pentagon. They required that I redact that conversation. But the import of the conversation was that I was surprised that those Israeli soldiers on the Bar-Lev line were surprised. Because we knew in advance, we knew definitively, we knew without a doubt.
We meaning America.
Yes, in American intelligence, in what's called G6. That's the department that deals with targeting the Middle East, including Israel. And so we knew, and somehow we didn't get the information that we knew to that Israeli soldier on the Bar-Lev line.
Explain what the Bar-Lev line is to our listeners.
The Bar-Lev line was a string of fortifications on the east bank of the Suez Canal. And they were under surprise attack on the 6th of October, Yom Kippur. It was a Saturday that year.
1973.
1973. And they had no idea. And that was the import of that conversation that I was monitoring. Here, this soldier on the Bar-Lev line calls to his mother, maybe on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and they had no idea in the world that there's someone listening to their conversation back in Washington. Not exactly Washington. NSA is at Fort Meade, which is between Washington and Baltimore.
So are you allowed to tell us how you heard that conversation? Was there an American ship in the waters off the coast of Israel picking up signals? Are you allowed to tell us?
I wouldn't be allowed to tell you, but I don't know anyway. That wasn't my job.
All right.
And in the intelligence community, unless you have a need to know, you don't inquire. So I had no need to know. And I had no idea that 50 years down the line, I might be writing a book documenting what happened at that time and subsequently.
All right, I just wanted to make that clear, because there are all sorts of videos on YouTube and all sorts of things on the internet accusing Israel of attacking, I think it was called the USS Liberty, if I'm not mistaken, at another time, and saying that Israel is inferring that Israel is an enemy of the United States. We had no reason to do so, etc. And on the Israeli side, what I don't remember where I heard it, but I heard that this ship was spying on Israel, picking up information, and then feeding that to the Egyptians. And of course, if Israel, in order for its own security, could not let something like that happen. And if indeed Israel did attack that ship, and we did it purposely, not by accident, then that could have been a reason. I don't have any more details. I just want to put that out there for people who have been only fed one side of the story. All right, so let's continue. So
Okay,
Israel did not get the information. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that, because I've been living and reliving what happened 50 years ago for the past 50 years. And one of the things that bothered me terribly was the fact that I felt mistrusted. In G6, the department that dealt with spying on the Middle East countries, I might have been the only Jew. I might have been. I have no way of knowing, but I probably was. And in 2020 hindsight, I see that I was probably dealt with under suspicion. And it happened because of what happened in 1967. a half a dozen years before the Yom Kippur War, when the Israelis attacked the Liberty. And what I learned only recently, like this past year, I read a book that 2 of the 3 pilots that attacked the Liberty were American Jews. And so it kind of makes sense that I, an American Jew working in US intelligence, might have been under suspicion. What I knew at that time was that middle management did not like the Israelis because many of their friends who were on the Liberty or were somehow connected with the Liberty were either killed or wounded. And so Israelis were not especially loved in G6. In fact, one of the terms that I heard some of the analysts use is they called Israelis mad dog. And you can understand maybe where this comes from.
All right. So you talked about when you were serving in the intelligence that there was something called the Jew room. What can you tell us about that?
Okay. What I can tell you is, again, at the time, I didn't know that it was called the Jew room. But what I did know was that there were rooms that were off limits to me in spite of my well above top secret clearances, off limits to me because I was a Jew. And I found out about this, and I can tell you about this because the Pentagon didn't require that I redact this. The head of the Hebrew department was my roommate, and I loved the guy. He got drunk one evening at a social event. And when we were talking shop, which is a big no-no, he let out, apparently his conscience was bothering him, number one. And number two, when the alcohol goes in, the truth comes out. He took his finger and he poked me seriously. There are rooms in NSA that you can't get into because you're a Jew. So I knew that rooms like that existed. I didn't know that it was called the Jew room. I learned this from John Loftus, who wrote a book called The Secret War Against the Jews, in which he interviewed members of the Jew room. And he says that it's an absolute misnomer because, number one, Jews are not allowed to even know that it exists, no less not being granted entry. And number two, it's not one room. It's not singular. It's a complex of rooms, or it was a complex of rooms. Whether it exists today or not.
Do you know what was in those rooms that they didn't want you to see?
Well, I think that one of the rooms was a room that I had to pass through to get to the teletype room. It was a teletype room, and one of my jobs was to send messages to a base in a foreign country. And I can't tell you which country because they made me redact that, but you can guess. It's one of the English-speaking countries. And in order to enter this room, it was a closed room, closed access room, similar to the room that I worked in as a Hebrew linguist, where you need to press a code in order to open the door. Now, I didn't have the code for this particular room that I had to walk through to get to the teletype. So what I needed to do was to ring the bell, like any doorbell on any normal home, and then take a step back, show my my card to the camera, and then wait like 5 minutes. And then someone would open the door and let me in. Why do I suspect that this might have been part of the Jew room? Because once when I did that, I rang the bell. I stepped back, showed my card, waited. Someone left very soon. And instead of waiting for the door to close, I slipped my foot in and I walked right in. And when I walked in, I saw on the back wall, huge wall, a ceiling to floor curtain was closing over a map, a huge map that covered the whole back wall. I felt like I was watching a James Bond movie. In the middle of the map was Israel and the Middle East. So that's why I think that maybe that room was part of the Jew room.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. So you had information in that when you were working in the NSA there that was vital to Israel's security. Israel was an ally of the United States. That information should have gone to Israel as an ally, and yet it was being withheld. And you knew that.
I didn't know it was being withheld at that
Okay.
time. I had no idea that it was being withheld. What I did know was that the intelligence, the vital intelligence that we had in our hands did not reach the Israeli soldiers on the Bar-Lev line or on any of the fronts. That's what I knew. And my assumption, giving the benefit of the doubt, my assumption at that time was somehow it might have gotten screwed up in transit. And we got it to our allies a little bit too late. That was my assumption. I didn't know, but that was my assumption. Only 5 years ago, when I sat with Eli Ze'ira, General Eli Ze'ira, at the time was the head of Amman, Israel Military Intelligence. He confided in me over his kitchen table that he received an intelligence assessment from his American intelligence general friends that the Arabs had no intention of attacking on or before October 6th. And he was pained to confide this in me.
So you're saying that they fed him false information in order to keep Israel from getting ready for this attack and taking care of what needed to be taken care of for its security. That's what you're saying.
Right. So
the president of the United States at that time was
Nixon.
Right.
Nixon.
And that means Kissinger was his
Secretary of State.
Yeah. And I remember hearing a phrase that Kissinger apparently told Nixon when Israel was begging for arms, that Kissinger said, let them bleed a little.
Right. This is well documented.
Explain that to our listeners.
Right.
Why he said that.
Okay. But I did want to say something that was related to my visit with Eli Ze'ira before I leave that. But remind me, get me back on track with the Kissinger thing. As soon as Eli Ze'ira confided in me, I wrote a piece. If you remember years ago, when you first interviewed me, maybe 25 or 30 years ago.
Not that long, but a long time ago.
It was a while ago. I had written for the Jerusalem Post and other American Jewish papers. And so I wrote this up. I said, people need to hear this, that Eli Ze'ira confided in me, admitted that he got a false intelligence assessment from his American friends. So I went to Haaretz with this write-up.
That was an Israeli media publication in Hebrew.
Right, an Israeli daily. And the editor read what I wrote, and he said, "This is explosive. Did you record him?" And I said, "No." "Did you have a witness with you?" I said, "No." He handed it back to me. He said, "Nobody is going to believe you." But in June of 2021, released from the IDF archives, the Israel Defense Forces archives, a protocol from the 7th of October, 1973, a day into the war, from Moshe Dayan, in which he said that he got an American intelligence assessment. Are you sitting down? 12 hours before the attack began on Yom Kippur, 12 hours from the Americans that the Arabs have no intention of attacking. 12 hours, completely confirming what Eliezer confided in me. Okay, now getting back to Kissinger. Do you believe in God? I know the answer to
Rhetorical
the
question, yes.
A neighbor of mine that I play music with, I gave her a call on her phone, on her mobile phone, and a guy answers her mobile phone. He says that he found this phone in Jerusalem. Do I know the owner of the phone? And I said, I do, and I'm coming into Jerusalem. I'll pick it up. I began talking to him, and I was in the process of finishing writing my book. And I asked him, a young man, maybe 40, I said, would you buy a book that discloses the truth behind the Yom Kippur War surprise? And he said, no. And he was very adamant about saying no. And he says, I say no because my father wrote a book on that subject. Mm. And he took me to his home and he gave me a copy of the book that was suppressed for 45 years. His father's life was threatened that he better not disseminate that book. He points an accusing finger at Henry Kissinger, and he has very strong proof.
Interesting.
Not only Henry Kissinger, you're still sitting down. Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan were part of the conspiracy, according to him.
According to his father, or according to Kissinger?
According to his father.
Uh-huh.
And in this book, it's called Hakesher HaMirubah. How would you translate that? The four-cornered connection.
Yeah.
The four corners, according to the book, are the Arabs, Assad and Sadat, the Soviets, the Americans, Kissinger, namely Kissinger, and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan.
And what would be the reason that he believes that they could have been part of this? What would be, I mean, this is very bad on their resume.
Very bad on their resume.
I just want to explain to our listeners that the Yom Kippur War, Israel was already taking public parks and using it for graveyards because they thought that we would have so many dead. And we thought that we might even, God forbid, lose the country. I mean, we were going to lose everything. And so to believe that that Golda Meir under her watch and Moshe Dayan, who's supposed to be the, amazing general with the eye patch, right? Explain to our listeners why he would say that.
Well, according to Kissinger, Kissinger understood from Sadat and Assad, and this has nothing to do with my book. You won't find any of this in my book, but you will find it in the four connection book, which I'm going to publish as well. You can interview me on that in detail later. Where was I?
About Kissinger and why Golda Meir would be in on this with
Right. So,
Moshe Dayan.
right. Thank you for getting me back on track. Kissinger understood from Sadat and Assad that they would refuse to accept land that was taken by Israel as a gift, namely the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West, what they call the West Bank. They only would get back what was taken from them by force of arms with force of arms. And so there had to be an orchestrated war. And so Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan were convinced by Kissinger that he could arrange an orchestrated war to bring about permanent peace in the Middle East. And so that's why they did it. Of course, it got out of hand.
So basically you're saying that the Arabs were saying they wanted to be like a gever, you're saying. They wanted to be like a brawny and say, we're going to get this land back by force, not by it being given as a present. That's what you're saying.
Right. It has.
But what did that have to do with Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan? Explain to our listeners.
Because they were interested in creating a situation that would bring about a permanent peace.
Something Israel's always been hoping for.
Right. Right. So if this were the reason that the permanent peace, if you want to call it permanent peace, came about, then the question is, was it worth the price? Almost 2,700 Israelis fell, and I claim that they fell, and I'm sorry to say this, most of them unnecessarily.
Yes, because we were caught off guard. And there's a story that says that when the Syrians were coming into Israel, because we were so caught off guard, we didn't have the forces. When they were coming in, their tanks, everything was open, and they just got so deep into Israel, they stopped because they thought this must be a trap. It can't be that we got this deep into Israel and nobody stopped us. This must be a trap. And they stopped. And because they stopped, it gave Israel time to call up its troops and get in there and try to hold whatever lines they could hold. It was just a miraculous story. So I just wanted our listeners to know that. Did you want to add something to it before the next question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would. On the Bar-Lev line, there was some 400 plus soldiers that were there, and they were sitting ducks. They were basically sitting ducks. Now, another finger of God incident that happened to me was on Agrippa Street in Jerusalem at a secondhand bookstore that you may remember, the Book Maven. And there I met a man, a very distinguished English gentleman by the name of Dani Ben Yaakov. And he said that he was at the command meeting a day before the Yom Kippur War broke out. And he proposed enacting a contingency plan which called for the removal of all the boys on the Bar-Lev line, because they were just sitting ducks. There was no way that they could repel the force of the entire Egyptian army. So this contingency plan called for removing them all and in their place putting remotely detonatable high explosives. Let the Egyptians cross, let them gather around the fortifications, and then blow them to smithereens. It would have been an easy plan to implement, and it would have been very cost-effective. It wouldn't have cost anything, hardly, to remove the boys. It would only have required 24 hours to execute, and it wouldn't have violated the American warning, don't preempt. But Eli Ze'ira poo-pooed Dani Ben Yaakov. He poo-pooed him, and it was never implemented. And these boys were sacrificed unnecessarily.
So you're accusing this Israeli general of making a mistake or purposely making this move? What is your stance?
Yes, good that you asked that question. I believe that he wisely relied on American intelligence, because American intelligence resources were not twice as much as Israel's, were not 3 times or 4 times or 5 times or 10 times. It was more than 50 times the resources that Israel had in its hands. I'll give you an example. A man contacted me because he saw that I write my name in Hebrew as Rashi Tevot. You can see here.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Rashi Tevot. And his last name is Brill as well.
Mm-hmm.
His name is Shabtai Brill. He was a high officer during the war. He's a man in his 80s today. And he was a pioneer of drone overflights back in the late 60s and the early 70s. He was a pioneer. How is he a pioneer? I mean, it brings a smile to my face. He bought American toy planes that were remotely controlled, and he affixed cameras to them, and he sent them over the Suez Canal. And how far could they reach? A few hundred meters, maybe, and then return and take not so great quality still pictures. At the same time, we in NSA had satellites sitting above the Sinai. I recall seeing a photograph of an Israeli army camp, and I could read the name of the Israeli soldier off of his kippah.
Wow.
And this is in 1973, 74. You know, compare that to Shabtai Brill's toy planes flying over the Suez Canal. So Eli Ze'ira was very correct in poo-pooing his own intelligence and relying on American intelligence. Mm-hmm. And anyway, there was a dress rehearsal the previous May in 73 and in January and May, there were maneuvers of the Egyptian army back then. And Eli Ze'ira said, don't worry, they're not going to attack. And he was right in January, he was right in May. And he was sure that he would be right again in October. And he relied on American intelligence, but he didn't realize that the intelligence assessment that he got was false.
More than a betrayal. It was vicious. It was deadly. It was.
But it wasn't America. It wasn't America. And that's, you know, I have a problem with this title because people read this and they say, "Oh, you're anti-American." And I say, "No, I'm not anti-American. I'm pro-American. In fact, I not
Just
only
the
do
bad
I have,
apples. There are some bad apples in the NSA.
not only do I have the Pentagon's approval, I have the Pentagon's approval to publish twice. Why twice? Yeah, I want to show you. This is the Hebrew.
Yes.
Why twice? Because after I sent the manuscript to the Pentagon for their review, and they gave me approval to publish under two conditions. One, that I redact what they demand I redact, which I did. I should have a bookmark in here so that you can see.
Okay.
You know, all throughout the book, there's redactions. That was demand number one. And demand number two, that I don't add one additional word of new content. Those are the two conditions. But after I found out about this protocol of Moshe Dayan that was released after I got the approval of the Pentagon, I felt I wanted to include it. So I sent it back for that reason and for a couple other reasons. One of the other reasons is something fascinating, and you should interview this man. One of the people who I use as corroboration, I have four people that worked for NSA besides me that work for NSA that corroborate what I say in the book. One of them was not a linguist. He was a technical fellow that was stationed in Germany in 1973. And his unit was reassigned quickly under duress to Italy at the beginning of October to prepare for the war that would really happen this time. Because in the past, they knew that it was just garbage. But this time, it was for real. And he asked his officer, "We're sharing this information with our Israeli friends, right?" And his officer said, "It's not your job to ask." And during the war, when they were collecting intelligence and passing the intelligence to us at headquarters at Fort Meade, he asked his supervisor again, "We're sharing this with our Israeli friends, aren't we?" And he says, "It's not your job to ask." He was so troubled by this, a non-Jew, a Gentile, a Texan who stands about 6'4", he converted to Judaism. He was so troubled by this.
Wow.
And he made Aliyah to Israel. And he's been living in Israel for the past about 15 years. You got to interview this guy.
Sure, you'll send me his name and contact info.
So I wanted to include his story in my book too. And another man who was a Kashab, monitor, who is monitoring Syrian military communication on the Golan Heights. And he said it was clear that they were going to attack the following day. And he passed this information urgently to Israeli headquarters. And it was ignored because ALLY'S DECEIT relied on the American assessment over his own intelligence. So I wanted to include Pfefferman. That was this man's name. I wanted to include Pfefferman's testimony. So for those three reasons, I sent my manuscript back to the Pentagon, and it was approved twice.
Oh, that's very nice to hear. I want to ask you though, in spite of that, there are still, as you say, pockets of anti-Semitism we know in the State Department, and you're saying in the NSA as well, and probably other places as well. But were you not afraid for your life for making these disclosures?
For sure. And quietly, I made these disclosures to a Knesset member back in the 90s. This is before I found out that we passed misinformation to the Israelis. All that I knew back then, and this was of interest to the Israelis, that we knew definitively days in advance. That we knew. So I wanted to share this quietly, and I wanted to get approval to share it quietly through the American embassy. But anyway, that's another story. I sat with Rechavam Ze'evi, and he said, Rechavam Ze'evi, General Rechavam Ze'evi, was a Knesset member. He asked me, what do you hope to gain by making these disclosures public? And this was in the early 90s, and I felt that it could help Jonathan Pollard, because that's what I was told by his sister, who was his big advocate at that time. Ze'evi said, I don't know if it'll help him, and I don't know how much it would help him, if it would help him, but I do know one thing: you're putting your life in jeopardy.
That's
and
what he told
everyone that's read my manuscript said the same thing. Bruce, aren't you afraid for your life? And I was paranoid. I was really paranoid. And I took a deep, deep breath before I sent the manuscript to the Pentagon. But I feel like an American, a true American, even though I've been most of my life here in Israel now. And I wanted to get America's approval, and I didn't want to risk divulging something that would have been a violation of my secrecy oath. And so that's why I took a deep breath and I sent the manuscript to the Pentagon.
We only have a few minutes left, and I have more questions I want to ask you, so maybe you can answer them in bullet points, if possible, okay? Your book, the subtitle says Military Anti-Semitism. Tell us about that.
Okay. That subtitle, in fact, the whole cover with the dagger penetrating the Israeli flag was not my idea. This one was my idea, where I'm working, monitoring what's going on the battlefront. That was my idea. This was a friend of mine who's a book publisher, and he was in my Arabic class in the U.S. Army. And he's one of the 4 corroborations. And he made this title and this book cover. And when he said military anti-Semitism, I said, I won't mention his name because he asked me not to mention his name, but his Arabic name was Karim. We all had Arabic names. And Karim said, what's your problem with it? So I said, my book talks about pro-Semitism. There were good people that came to my aid as a Jew. After I was dumped on and discriminated against as a Jew, there were people who were like my savior. I said, so it should say a memoir of military anti-Semitism and pro-Semitism. And what did Karim say? He says, pro-Semitism doesn't sell books.
I was thinking maybe he was going to say there is no pro-Semitism, it's just pro-humanity on a human level, that they were benevolent like that and wanted to help you.
So he liked this title as well. And I went to the OU. I wanted to have a book launch at the OU. And the people, the management in the OU said, I can't invite you to give a talk on a book with a title like that. It sounds anti-American.
Mm-hmm. And you're not anti-American, as you said. There are I mean, the American people are some of the best people in the world. And though there, as I said, there are pockets of anti-Semitism, and then there are generalities as well. We know that the State Department, as I said previously, is very anti-Semitic. So I know you wanted to talk about, because some people ask you, do you hate America? Why don't you just get that clear one more time for everybody?
Okay, not at all. Not at all. I'll give you an example of how Americans, I believe most Americans love Israel. When my wife and I were on our honeymoon in America, we stopped in a small town called Fenwick, West Virginia. And the town council was having a meeting, and they asked us to please sign the guest book. And one of the council members came over and looked at our signatures and said, "Gentlemen of the council, I'd like to introduce you to Bruce and Vivian Brill from Jerusalem, Israel." They, all of them, got up and applauded. I mean, whenever I tell this story, I get choked up. It shows that most Americans, most grassroots Americans.
Yeah, grassroots, I would say, in this, and in the South also. There's a
they love
difference.
Israel.
There's
They
different
love
character
Israel.
parts, parts of America.
And I love them back.
I want to invite our producer back on. I want to have Yehuda Meir come back on camera because he wanted to add something to what we were talking about. Can we get you back on? Let's see
Sure.
if we can get you.
Yeah, there we are.
We hear you, but we don't see you. Just a moment. Let's see if we can get you back on.
I'm clicking start video. There we are. Are you clicking also? Because I'm clicking start video.
Let's see if we can do that.
Okay.
There we go. Okay,
There
you
he
wanted
is.
to add something.
I heard a story, Bruce, from a fellow that I met in Rehovot a few years ago, who was a soldier in 1973. I think he was on the Golan, I'm not sure. A little bit older than me. And he told a very interesting story that I don't know how he heard it, but I had every reason to believe that he was credible. He said that when Kissinger and Nixon were withholding the resupply of arms to Israel, because in the middle of the war, Israel was running short of arms and they were demanding to get them or requesting them from the States. The story he told me was that there was an embargo, or there was a lot of resistance to sending in the arms. And Golda Meir, this is the way I heard the story. I'm not saying it's true. This is the way I heard it from a guy that I think is credible. Golda Meir contacted Nixon, I believe, or Kippur, maybe both, and said, if you don't send us the arms, we will launch a nuclear weapon at Moscow. They will see that it came from the States. They will start a nuclear war, and we don't care. That's the story that I heard.
Okay, well, of course, I have nothing that I could add. I was a little guy.
Yeah.
Time. But what I can say is that Golda Meir and Richard Nixon loved each other. They really respected each other. And if you read Alexander Haig's Inner Circles, he talks about a critical meeting in the Oval Office several days into the war when Israel really need resupply, and Schlesinger and Weinberger and Kissinger, all Jewish names, were dragging their feet. And this was in the Oval Office. Nixon asked Kissinger, do you have the wish list of the Israelis? He says, yes, I have it here in my pocket. And Nixon said, double it. Get the hell out of here and do it right away.
I want to say that what you were talking about, Yehuda Meir, about this story that Golda Meir said that an atomic bomb, that that we would do this. There was a novel by Leonard Harris called The Masada Plan. Did you ever read that book? That was a novel. It was basically I mean, I read it, must have been maybe 30 or more years ago. So I hope I have it right. But basically, it's like the idea that if Israel's going to go down, then everybody's going to go down, that we are not going to be victims anymore.
Right.
And the whole world will just write poetry about what wonderful people we were, that they're going to have to step up to the plate and stop another Holocaust from taking place.
So
if
what I heard was not
anybody is
unique.
looking for a
Okay.
novel, you might want to pick that one up. It's called The
Okay.
Masada Plan.
Except like Joel Rosenberg's books turn out to be not to be novels, because the Last Jihad and the Last
just
Days.
like 1984 turned out not to be a novel.
Exactly.
They had to take it out of the fiction section in the library and put it into the reality. All right, Bruce Brill, before we go, what do you want people to take away from your book, and then tell us where people can get it?
Well, it's more than just a personal memoir, although that's what you would call it. It describes, for the first time in 50 years, how Israel fell prey to the deception. Because there was one man, Professor Yaakov Hizdai. He was an investigator on the Agronaut Commission. He said, how did this befall us? Who screwed up? Who made the mistakes? To this very day, we don't have a clear answer. And he said that just a few years ago. I believe that if you read my book, you'll see a clear answer.
And where can people pick up your book?
It's now on Ingram Spark. It's on Amazon. You can get it at Barnes and Nobles. I understand it's on other platforms. The Hebrew, I just picked it up. It just came out. The Hebrew just came out. I picked it up a couple days ago for the first time. And so you might see that in the bookstores here. You can get it through Tzameret. That's the publisher in Israel.
Well, you also have a link on your website, brucebrill.com.
You're putting a fire under my proverbial. I have to get that happening.
Get that in there. Okay. All right. So you can go to Amazon. You can find that. Again, it's called Deceit of an Ally, and it's by Bruce Brill. And I want to thank you for coming on. Very interesting and sad to hear a story about the relationship with Israel and the NSA, the American government, parts of it at that time when we lost so many soldiers needlessly, when an ally was supposed to give this information to us. I
have time to ask one question.
Sure.
I have time to ask one quick question. I was looking this up during your interview. The Libyan airliner was shot down over the Sinai in 1973, was in February. And you, Bruce, mentioned two dates that Syria told you that the American intelligence said the Arabs weren't going to attack. One was in January, and one was later in the year, I think in May, you said. So that Libyan airliner was shot down over the Sinai by Israeli jets in February of 73. Is there any connection to your knowledge?
I don't know. But I do know that when that happened, the middle management in NSA was saying, mad dog Israelis. Another example.
Bruce Brill, thank you so much for coming on the program and talking about this important part of history that most people just do not know, but now they do.
Thank you, Tamar, for having me and for getting the truth out.
Hey everyone, to make sure you can get access to all of our interviews, make sure to hit the subscribe button on both our YouTube and Rumble channels. Your click makes us all stronger. Thanks.